1960. Across Africa, new nations celebrate freedom. French colonial flags come down, drums of independence thunder in the air. But behind the jubilation, in the shadows, a new empire is taking shape. An empire without name or flag. One that will bind Africa to France long after official colonialism ends. They call it Françafrique. France's hidden empire in Africa has begun. A few years earlier, France's future president, François Mitterrand, warned, "Without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century." It was less a prediction than a directive. From President Charles de Gaulle onward, French leaders understood that to remain a global power, France must cling to its African realm. Thus, as overt colonial rule crumbled, a covert system rose in its place, one of puppet presidents, secret deals, and shadow wars. This is the story of Françafrique, the neo-colonial web that Paris spun across a supposedly liberated continent. In 1960, a wave of freedom sweeps across Africa. In the span of 1 year, 17 nations break the chains of colonial rule, 14 of them from France's empire. The era of colonialism is ending before our eyes. Rewind to 1945. France has just emerged from Nazi occupation, its pride wounded. To restore its world power status after the humiliation of World War II, France clings tightly to its overseas empire. From Indochina to North Africa, anti-colonial uprisings flare. France's leaders refuse to let go. Their global standing seems to depend on it. In 1954, that illusion shatters on a remote battlefield in Vietnam. A French garrison falls at Dien Bien Phu, crushed by Vietnamese revolutionaries. It's a staggering defeat, marking the end of French Indochina. Almost simultaneously, another colonial war rages in Algeria. France is determined to keep Algeria at any cost, but the cost is high. By the late 1950s, Algeria's war of independence has polarized France and brought the Fourth Republic to its knees. May 1958. European settlers and army officers in Algiers rise up, furious at Paris's failures. They demand a savior. Enter General Charles de Gaulle. The hero of World War II is called out of retirement to rescue France from chaos. In June 1958, de Gaulle assumes extraordinary powers amid the Algeria crisis. De Gaulle is a realist. He knows the old colonial order is unsustainable, yet he's unwilling to let France lose its global influence. Without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. Future President François Mitterrand warns in 1957. De Gaulle shares this view. France must remain a great power, and Africa is the key to that grandeur. August 24th, 1958. Brazzaville, capital of French Equatorial Africa. De Gaulle acknowledges that African colonies aspire to independence, but he has a plan. They should go through a period of political learning in the French community, he declares. De Gaulle's proposal, baked into France's new Fifth Republic constitution, is bold. African territories can choose autonomy within a French African community or immediate full independence. It's presented as a generous offer, but there's a veiled ultimatum. As de Gaulle makes clear, a no vote means secession, and France will sever all financial and material aid. September 28, 1958. Across French West and Equatorial Africa, people vote in a referendum on de Gaulle's offer. A oui means join the French community, a path to eventual independence under French supervision. A non means instant independence with all the risks that entails. Every territory votes yes, except one. In Guinea, a young nationalist leader, Ahmed Sékou Touré, dares to defy de Gaulle. Touré famously declares, "It is better to be poor and free than to live in opulence and be a slave." Guinea votes non. On October 2, 1958, it becomes the first French African colony to demand immediate independence, with Touré as president. France's response is swift and ruthless. Feeling betrayed, Paris effectively ostracizes Guinea. French personnel and aid are withdrawn overnight. Colonial administrators hastily destroy files, rip out telephone lines, even sabotaging infrastructure as they depart. This isn't just a sulking exit, it's a calculated warning. France intends to make Guinea an example. When Touré asks to keep Guinea in the French currency zone, de Gaulle's government banishes Guinea from the franc and isolates its economy. Behind the scenes, things turn even darker. In 1959, French intelligence launches Operation Persil, a covert plot to flood Guinea with counterfeit currency and wreck its finances. The message is clear: breaking from France will not be easy. Guinea survives by leaning on the Eastern Bloc, but the episode sends a chill through Africa. Other leaders see what happened and conclude, better to accept France's embrace than suffer its wrath. And so, in 1960, as 13 other French African colonies move to independence, they do so hand in hand with France. Flags change and anthems play, but in many ways, little else does. France is determined to grant independence on its own terms, retaining as much leverage as possible over its former territories. This strategic shift, from direct colonial rule to indirect neo-colonial control, is now underway. De Gaulle and his inner circle quietly craft a framework to maintain France's dominance in Africa while outwardly accepting decolonization. They call it cooperation. 1961, France establishes a new Ministry of Cooperation, built out of the old colonial ministry. Its mission? Manage relationships with the newly independent African states. Dozens of bilateral agreements are signed on defense, economics, culture, education, binding the ex-colonies to France in all but name. French advisors flood African capitals. French companies secure lucrative rights to African oil, minerals, and markets. The currencies of 14 African countries remain tied to the French franc through the CFA franc monetary union, ensuring Paris holds the purse strings. In return, France provides aid, investments, and promises of protection to friendly African regimes. France also keeps troops in Africa. A network of military bases from Dakar to Djibouti gives France a free extraterritorial zone for its forces on the continent. Defense pacts guarantee France the right to intervene if allies are threatened, and intervene it does. On average, about once a year, France launches a military operation in Africa, acting as self-appointed guardian of stability. The pattern emerges quickly. When a pro-French leader is in danger, French paratroopers appear on the scene. When a Marxist or anti-French movement gains ground, Paris moves to contain it. The world sees a new era of African independence. But behind the scenes, France is engineering a system to preserve its power. At the center of this system is a man few outside of insider circles know: Jacques Foccart, de Gaulle's chief advisor on African affairs. De Gaulle appoints Foccart as Secretary General for African and Malagasy Affairs in 1960, effectively making him the point man for France's new Africa policy. Jacques Foccart is a former resistance fighter, a master of espionage and political networking. De Gaulle trusts him implicitly. In the shadows, Foccart builds an elaborate African cell at the Élysée, a tight-knit group of presidential advisors, himself at the core, who make all key Africa decisions and backdoor meetings. With direct phone lines to African heads of state, Foccart bypasses the French Foreign Ministry. This is a parallel, back-channel diplomacy. Foccart orchestrates a dense web of personal networks between French and African elites. These ties are often informal, even familial. Presidents on both sides call each other by first names, exchange favors, and strike secret deals. "It's like a family," Foccart would say, and indeed President de Gaulle affectionately dubs him Monsieur Afrique, Mr. Africa. France's closest African allies gladly partake in this arrangement. Ivory Coast's president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, for instance, enjoys French support and investment. In return, he staunchly aligns with Paris. Houphouët-Boigny even coins a term for the cozy relationship, Françafrique, a proud reference to the interlinked destiny of France and Africa. But in the backrooms of Paris, critics have another name for Foccart's vast patronage network. They call it Françafrique. By the mid-1960s, the framework is firmly in place. Independence is real on paper, but through military bases, economic domination, and hand-picked African leaders, France maintains a hidden empire. This system, opaque, lucrative, and often ruthless, will soon be known as Françafrique. Decades later, French scholar François-Xavier Verschave would dub it the longest scandal of the Republic, a neo-colonial web of political, economic, and military actors conspiring to keep African resources flowing to France. But back in the early 1960s, few could see this hidden empire for what it was. To the public, France simply appeared to be helping its former colonies stand on their own feet. In reality, de Gaulle and Foucault were ensuring France never really left Africa at all. The true nature of Françafrique would reveal itself in moments of crisis. We will see in the next chapter how, in 1964, when a coup d'etat unseated a French-friendly president in Gabon, 2,000 French troops were dispatched within days to restore him. Time and again, when French interests hung in the balance, the old colonial reflex kicked in. What began with de Gaulle's return in 1958 as a strategy to salvage French grandeur had, by the 1960s, created a shadowy empire of influence. Chapter 1 has unveiled how France replaced formal rule with informal control through back channels, cooperation, and coup. This was the birth of Françafrique, France's hidden empire in Africa, launched in the embers of colonial empire and poised to shape the continent's fate for decades to come.
Vrai pour l'homme, l'est autant pour les sociétés et les peuples. C'est ce souci de dignité, cet impérieux besoin de liberté. La liberté, c'est le privilège de tout homme, le droit naturel de toute société ou de tout peuple, la base sur laquelle les États africains s'associeront à la République française et à d'autres États pour le développement de leurs valeurs et de leurs richesses communes. Nous avons, quant à nous, un premier et indispensable besoin, celui de notre dignité. Or, il n'y a pas de dignité sans liberté. Nous préférons la pauvreté dans la liberté à la richesse dans l'esclavage.
October 2nd, 1958, Guinea becomes the first French West African colony to declare full independence. President Ahmed Sékou Touré's bold rejection of France's proposed post-colonial community stunned Paris and electrified Africa. Touré's defiant proclamation, poverty and freedom over wealth and bondage, is a direct rebuke to French President Charles de Gaulle. It is a euphoric moment for Guineans, but it comes at a steep price. France, humiliated and alarmed, moves swiftly to make Guinea an example for any others entertaining similar dreams of unfettered sovereignty. France's response is swift and ruthless. Within days of Guinea's no vote to continued French tutelage, French administrators, technicians, and military advisors abruptly withdraw, abandoning the new nation to its fate. But they do more than just leave. They dismantle everything possible on the way out. Archival accounts describe departing French personnel removing light bulbs, tearing up blueprints for sewage systems, and even burning medicines rather than leaving them behind. Pension payments to thousands of Guinean veterans who fought for France are suddenly halted. Telephone lines go dead as cables are cut. Ports and warehouses empty as food shipments are diverted mid-ocean. What had been one of France's model colonies is plunged into darkness, literally as light bulbs vanish from offices and homes, and into an orchestrated economic chaos. This scorched earth departure is a vengeance and a warning. A French official bluntly calls it Operation Teachable Moment, off the record, of course. By crippling Guinea's infrastructure and economy, France intends to deter other colonies from following Guinea's example. The message, independence, if taken on African terms rather than French terms, will mean isolation and suffering. Sékou Touré's government, left with a shell of a country, scrambles to keep basic services running. By 1960, Guinea is still standing, barely. Sékou Touré has kept his promise of freedom in poverty, forging a socialist path with help from Eastern Bloc friends. But France is not done. In the shadows of Paris, a secretive cell led by Jacques Foucault, de Gaulle's Africa fixer, crafts a plan to wash away the Guinea problem. They call it Opération Persil, named after a popular laundry detergent, as if the very existence of Touré's government is a stain to be scrubbed out. The French Secret Service sets out to sabotage Guinea's economy from within. Weeks after Guinea creates its own currency and central bank, French agents begin forging large quantities of Guinean francs. The plan? Flood Guinea's markets with counterfeit bills, sparking hyperinflation and economic collapse. A tactic reminiscent of the Nazis' wartime plot to counterfeit British pounds. Simultaneously, France funnels arms to Guinean dissidents in exile, organizing them into rebel bands to provoke unrest and even civil war. It is a covert operation of economic warfare and political destabilization, sanctioned at the highest levels in Paris. For a time, Operation Persil runs under deep cover, but Guinea's security services get wind of strange new banknotes circulating, and of arms caches appearing across the border. The scheme leaks. In May 1960, a dramatic expose. Senegalese police in Dakar intercept a truckload of weapons hidden in barrels of soap, arms bound for anti-Touré rebels. Senegal's Prime Minister Mamadou Dia is outraged to discover his country used as a staging ground. He lodges an official complaint to Paris. Caught red-handed, the French government hastily washes its hands of Operation Persil. The covert operation is quietly shelved to avoid further embarrassment. On the diplomatic stage, France continues to box Guinea out. Paris refuses to sponsor Guinea's entry into the United Nations. It takes the support of countries like Iraq and Ghana to get Guinea admitted. French allies in West Africa, such as Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny, distance themselves from Touré. Some even collaborate in efforts to undermine him. By the early 1960s, Guinea is a lonely outpost of radical independence, encircled by a hostile Franco-African network. Sékou Touré's regime grows paranoid and repressive under constant siege, convinced that France will never forgive his audacity. And indeed, the pattern is set. No African leader who defies the unwritten rules of Françafrique can expect an easy road. The next warning to Africa comes not in the form of sabotage, but direct military force. Fast forward to February 1964. We're in Gabon, a small but oil-rich nation in Central Africa, and a jewel in France's neo-colonial crown. Its president, Léon Meyba, is a longtime French loyalist, known in Paris as l'ami de la France. But on the night of February 17th, a group of young Gabonese military officers decide they've had enough. In the early hours of February 18th, 1964, 150 Gabonese soldiers stage a coup d'etat, detaining President Léon Meyba and his French advisors. At dawn, Gabonese citizens wake to the astonishing news. The strongman who ruled them since independence is deposed. On Radio Libreville, the coup leaders pointedly ask France to stay out of it. Gabon, they insist, will handle its own affairs now. President Mba, under guard, is even forced to broadcast a short speech admitting defeat. Injustices have exhausted the people's patience, he says haltingly. It has boiled over. It seems a new era might be dawning in Gabon, free from French influence. 800 miles away in Paris, Charles de Gaulle is not about to lose Gabon. Meyba has been one of France's most steadfast clients in Africa, a man who once declared that all Gabonese have two fatherlands, France and Gabon. To de Gaulle, the coup in Gabon is intolerable. Almost immediately, the Élysée invokes secret defense pacts signed with Gabon's former colonial authorities. The official stance: France will restore the legitimate government in Libreville. Privately, orders go out to mobilize paratroopers and foreign legionnaires. President Mba's plea for help is a mere formality, and since he's in custody, French officials hurriedly draft a letter of invitation for Gabon's vice president to sign after the fact. De Gaulle's advisors, notably Jacques Foccart again, work phones through the night. The plan: a dawn airborne operation to snatch Gabon back into the fold. Less than 24 hours after the coup began, French troops descend on Libreville. Paratroopers from bases in Dakar and Brazzaville land at the airport and secure the capital. They move with precision, facing only scattered resistance. In a brief firefight at the military camp, several Gabonese soldiers are killed. One French paratrooper is fatally wounded in action. The coup leaders, taken completely by surprise, are overpowered and arrested within hours. By February 20th, Léon Meiba is back in the presidential palace, flanked by French officers and smiling for newspaper cameras. France has unilaterally reversed an African regime change, a jaw-dropping display of neo-colonial muscle. In Paris, officials justify the invasion by citing treaty obligations and a call from Gabon's legitimate government. Behind closed doors, de Gaulle praises the operation's speed. The French press, controlled by the state, portrays the intervention as France saving Gabon from chaos. The 1964 Gabon coup and its reversal send shockwaves across Africa. In an era of nominal independence, the sight of French tanks in Libreville feels like the colonial era reasserting itself on the evening news. Many recall how quickly France reacted. Within a single day of Meiba's ouster, French forces were on the ground, propping him back up. The message could not be clearer. These early post-colonial showdowns, Guinea's economic strangulation, and Gabon's overnight coup reversal, broadcast an unmistakable warning to every African leader. Defying France comes at a high cost. Sékou Touré's Guinea was isolated, sabotaged, made to suffer in darkness. And when Gabon soldiers tried to take destiny into their own hands, French paratroopers arrived before the ink was dry on their proclamations, guns drawn. In private meetings and hushed phone calls, presidents and prime ministers across Francophone Africa took note. As one diplomat put it, "We all saw what happened to Guinea. We all saw what happened in Gabon. Nobody wanted to be next." By 1960, most French African colonies chose a more cautious path to independence, opting to retain close ties with Paris, adopt the French-backed CFA franc currency, and host French military bases, rather than risk a Guinea-style punishment. Those who dared flirt with the Soviet Union or nationalist radicalism often did so looking over their shoulder. France's hidden empire had made itself visible. Through francs and force, it would police its interests. The cost of defiance was now etched in the minds of a generation of African statesmen. Françafrique, the shadowy system of influence tying Africa to its former colonial master, had revealed its iron fist. Guinea and Gabon, two very different dramas, taught the same lesson. To challenge France's post-colonial order was to invite economic ruin or swift military retribution. It was, in effect, an insurance policy for French interests. No African leader could say they hadn't been warned. And as the next chapters will show, many heeded that warning, with some choosing to resist regardless, and others resigning themselves to play by France's rules, however compromising. The stage was set for decades of intrigue in France's hidden empire in Africa. Independence across Africa in the 1960s may have raised new flags and new anthems, but France's hold on its former colonies did not simply vanish. In the shadows, a set of powerful tools ensured Paris kept a firm grip over its ex-empires. This chapter explores these tools of influence: military force, monetary control, corporate power, and political intrigue that together define the system known as Françafrique. Even as African nations celebrated their freedom, secret agreements and enduring presences were already shaping the next chapter of French influence. Through military bases, the CFA franc currency, French corporate monopolies, and covert back-channel dealings, France maintained a decisive presence in its former empire. Military bases. One of the most visible pillars of France's post-colonial influence was its military presence. At the moment of independence, France secured defense pacts that allowed it to station troops and maintain military bases across its former colonies. From Dakar to Djibouti, these installations became strategic launch pads, letting French forces deploy at a moment's notice under the guise of mutual defense. Officially, the bases were meant to protect the new nations from external threats. In practice, they often served to safeguard French interests and prop up friendly regimes. When an allied ruler was in danger, or a leader veered out of France's orbit, intervention came swiftly. Since 1960, France has intervened militarily in Africa over 50 times, frequently framing its actions as requests for help from the very governments it helped install. In 1964, when a military coup in Gabon unseated President Léon Maiba, France's response was immediate. Within hours, French paratroopers landed in Libreville and restored Maiba to power by force, a clear signal that Paris would not hesitate to reinstate its preferred leaders. Time and again during the Cold War, French troops acted as kingmakers and crisis solvers in Africa, often ensuring that those in power remained aligned with French interests. French corporate monopolies. Economic control extended beyond currencies and central banks. In the decades after independence, French companies entrenched themselves as dominant players in key sectors of African economies. From oil and minerals to banking, transportation, and telecom, the commanding heights of commerce in many Francophone countries were occupied by French multinationals. In resource-rich nations like Gabon, French corporations operated with virtually free rein. The oil giant Elf Aquitaine, founded by General de Gaulle in 1963 as a state enterprise, became virtually synonymous with Gabon's petroleum industry. For years, Elf extracted Gabon's oil while channeling kickbacks into secret slush funds, enriching Gabon's President Omar Bongo and lubricating the campaigns of French political parties. The infamous Elf Affair trials in the 1990s revealed how oil profits had bankrolled French politicians and African elites alike, all under the veneer of legitimate business. It laid bare an elaborate system of state-sanctioned corruption that had long been an open secret. France's grip on natural resources was mirrored in other sectors. In Niger, for example, the French state-owned firm Areva, now Orano, held a near monopoly on uranium mining for decades. Every year, around 3,000 tons of Nigerian uranium were shipped to France to fuel its nuclear power plants. Even as Niger remained one of the poorest countries in the world, similar dominance occurred in agriculture and finance. French agribusiness giants controlled export crops, and French banks often dictated credit and investment in the region, benefiting from preferential contracts dating back to the colonial era. Control of infrastructure was another cornerstone of economic influence. The French logistics conglomerate Bolloré, for instance, came to dominate port and transport operations across West and Central Africa. By the 2010s, Bolloré's Africa division held a near monopoly on ports in 15 nations, managing major container terminals from Lomé to Douala. Such dominance, frequently secured through opaque concession deals, meant that critical trade gateways and the lucrative fees they generated remained in French hands. The result was that African economies stayed tethered to French companies. Profits flowed back to Paris, while local development was often hamstrung, perpetuating a cycle of dependency. Political backchannels. Perhaps the most insidious tool of influence was an elaborate web of unofficial diplomacy and covert action, a shadow empire managed directly from the Élysée Palace. In public, French leaders spoke of cooperation and development aid. Behind closed doors, they ensured loyalty through secret deals, intelligence operations, and occasionally, brute force. General de Gaulle entrusted his advisor Jacques Foccart with maintaining French control in Africa by any means necessary, legal or illegal. Under Foccart's guidance, the Africa Cell at the French presidency became the nerve center of Françafrique's clandestine operations. Through this parallel channel of influence, France propped up pliant strongmen and undermined or removed those deemed problematic. From the 1960s through the 1980s, French policy in Africa followed a ruthless logic of backing dictatorships, rigging elections, and even condoning political assassinations in the name of preserving influence. Through these back channels, France became a kingmaker on the African continent. When Omar Bongo assumed the presidency of Gabon in 1967, it was done with Foccart's blessing and covert French support. In return, Bongo guaranteed French access to Gabon's oil and remained one of Paris's staunchest clients for over 4 decades. Across Francophone Africa, similar stories abounded. France's preferred allies received military aid, political cover, and financial assistance to stay in power, while those who defied French interests, whether nationalist revolutionaries or inconvenient reformers, often met fates tarnished by coups or mysterious ends. The unwritten rule was clear: align with Paris and prosper, or challenge the system and risk chaos. Corruption was the lubricant of this neo-colonial system. French political parties and officials benefited from illicit flows of African money, often delivered in unmarked suitcases and off-the-books accounts. Everyone knew that when a French leader came to Gabon, he almost always left with a suitcase of cash, admitted one insider years later. These clandestine payments ensured that regardless of who occupied the Élysée or led the African state, the patron-client network of Françafrique remained intact. The political back-channel was not just about enriching individuals, but enforcing a geopolitical order. French intelligence agencies kept close watch on African affairs, covertly orchestrating events when needed. They deployed mercenaries like the notorious Bob Denard for deniable operations, funneled arms to allies in various civil conflicts, and shielded friendly dictators from international pressure. Scandals such as the Diamond Affair and the Elf Oil bribes hinted at the depths of these underground dealings. At every turn, the shadow of French influence loomed large, often hidden from the public, but painfully evident in the outcomes on the ground. Together, these mechanisms, military might, financial control, economic dominance, and covert manipulation, formed the backbone of Françafrique. It was, in effect, an empire by other means. French troops, banks, companies, and spies, all working in concert to maintain a grip on Africa long after the colonial era's official end. For the peoples of Africa, the effects of this system were profound. Decades after independence, many nations remained locked in a neo-colonial embrace, their security apparatus beholden to French oversight, their currency constrained by foreign guardianship, their natural wealth siphoned abroad, and their political destiny often decided in Paris. This was the pact of Françafrique: independence in name, dependence in reality. In the afterglow of independence, a darker battle raged off camera. Across Francophone Africa, whispers spoke of hidden hands and midnight plots, the unmistakable imprint of Françafrique. This system, born in backrooms of Paris and colonial capitals, meant that political changes were often engineered, not elective. Its most dramatic expression, coup d'état, sudden regime changes frequently traced back to France's tacit approval or direct intervention. January 13, 1963, Togo. Africa's first post-colonial coup unfolds before dawn. President Sylvanus Olympio, the nationalist who led Togo to independence, flees through darkened streets. He hides by the U.S. Embassy gate as gunshots echo. Soldiers surround him, among them a French-trained sergeant, Gnassingbé Eyadema. Olympio's body is found lifeless hours later. The military cites local grievances, but the subtext tells a larger story. Olympio had dared to distance Togo from France, even planning to replace the CFA franc, France's currency in Africa, with a new Togolese currency. It was an audacious bid for true sovereignty, one that may have signed his death warrant. Once a foot soldier in France's colonial army, Eyadema was instrumental in Olympio's assassination. The coup was deeply rooted in Olympio's efforts to break from lingering colonial ties. The pro-Paris candidate, Nicolas Grunitsky, is swiftly installed in Olympio's place, reassuring the old patron that Togo would stay in line. It is Françafrique's opening act, a head of state eliminated at the crossroads of local ambition and foreign neo-colonial interest. February 1964, Gabon. Another drama. President Léon Meiba, a staunch French ally, is ousted by Gabonese army officers fed up with his autocratic ways. For 2 days, a reformist rival sits in MBA's chair. But Paris will not have it. Charles de Gaulle dispatches elite French paratroopers from bases nearby. In a swift intervention, they crush the coup and reinstall Mba as president. The neutral justification is a defense pact, but the message is clear: France's favorites shall not fall. After being informed of the coup, French President de Gaulle resolved to restore Mba, honoring a 1960 treaty. French paratroopers toppled the rebel government and reinstated Mbah. Once back in power, Mbah exacts brutal revenge on his opponents, ruling under the protective watch of French troops until his death a few years later. Françafrique had drawn its red line in Gabonese soil. September 1979, Bangui, Central African Empire. The eccentric self-proclaimed Emperor Jean Bédel Bokassa has gone from French darling to international embarrassment. Paris had indulged his excesses for years, until news of massacred schoolchildren and a diamond scandal broke. Now, the former patron turns executioner. In Operation Kaban à Barracuda, French paratroopers swoop in to depose Bokassa while he's abroad. They reinstall ex-President David Dacko, a pliant figure, in a bloodless coup backed by the tricolor. Locals nickname the French soldiers Les Barracudas after the operation. Indeed, the Central African Republic would become France's military playground for decades. A 2013 review noted it had the most frequent and blatant French military interference in Africa's post-independence history, with French troops repeatedly installing or removing Central African leaders and crushing revolts. Bokassa's ouster was just one vivid episode, an emperor overthrown with a Gallic shrug to protect France's image and interests. October 1995, Moroni, Comoros. In this tiny Indian Ocean nation, coups d'etats seem almost routine, many orchestrated by one man, Bob Denard, a French mercenary who had made and unmade Comorian presidents like a personal fiefdom. Denard, long suspected of ties to French intelligence, launches yet another coup, his fourth, codenamed Operation Kaskari. With a band of European and African gunmen, he seizes the presidential palace and declares a new government. But times have changed in Paris. President Jacques Chirac, eager to appear a responsible world actor, decides Denard has outlived his usefulness. France greenlights Operation Azalée, a joint assault by French special forces, naval commandos, and paratroopers. Within days, Denard is arrested and flown to France in handcuffs. The mercenary coup is undone by its very enabler. Operation Azalée took place in 1995 to remove the provisional government, led and put into power by French mercenary Bob Denard. It's a rare instance of France thwarting a coup it effectively spawned, a neat illustration of Françafrique's Janus face, backing strongmen in one moment only to betray them in the next, as convenient. From 1960s power grabs to 1990s cloak and dagger adventures, France's shadow loomed over many a putsch. The pattern was set. If a francophone African leader drifted too far from Paris, or if Paris's interests demanded a shuffle at the top, the knives came out. Sometimes French agents incited the changes, other times French forces reversed them, always to keep the neo-colonial order intact. By the end of the Cold War, French-led coups or interventions had hit a notorious roll call. Togo, Gabon, Benin, Central African Republic, Chad, Cameroon, Comoros, repeatedly. A who's who of Francophone Africa's map. Through it all, French companies reaped profits and friendly dictators kept power, greased by murky kickbacks and campaign funds flowing back to political patrons in Paris. Françafrique was less a conspiracy theory than a decades-long open secret, a pact of elites, African and French, to maintain France's backyard dominion. But as the 21st century dawned, cracks in this system widened. Coups have not ceased. On the contrary, a new wave is crashing in the 2020s, now outside France's control. In fact, recent coups in Africa have predominantly occurred in ex-French colonies. A BBC survey noted in 2023, from the Sahel to the equator, angry young officers are toppling governments, and often pointing a defiant finger at France afterward. In Mali, in 2020, soldiers overthrew a president closely allied with Paris, then ushered in a junta that accused France of failure and ordered French troops out. In Burkina Faso, 2 coups in 2022 followed a similar script. The second coup leader, a 34-year-old captain, openly courted new partners, even Russian paramilitaries, while telling France to pack up its bases. In Niger, July 2023, A coup against a pro-French president sparked mass rallies where demonstrators waved Russian flags and chanted anti-French slogans. Even in stable Gabon, August 2023 brought a bolt from the blue. The French-friendly Bongo family dynasty, in power since 1967, was unseated in a morning by its own military. The through line in these upheavals? Public anger at France's role. One report observes that many locals believe Paris has long endorsed their nation's most tyrannical leaders, valuing compliant regimes over democracy. Now, those pent-up frustrations are exploding. Ironically, France finds itself not behind these coups, but the target of them, an unintended consequence of Françafrique's legacy. The stage is set for a dramatic confrontation between a new generation of African assertiveness and the old neo-colonial guard. If France often chose who stayed in power, it also had a hand in who fell, especially when African leaders dared to defy the unwritten rules of Françafrique. Chapter 4 unravels the fates of those bold few who said non to Paris and paid dearly. These are the rebels and martyrs of Francophone Africa's post-colonial saga. Presidents and premiers who tried to chart an independent path, only to find themselves isolated, overthrown, or 6 feet under. Sylvanus Olympio of Togo was one such figure. Educated in London, fiercely proud, he envisioned a Togo free from France's monetary and military shackles. In late 1962, Olympio took the radical step of withdrawing from the CFA franc currency, planning a national Togolese currency to assert economic independence. He refused to integrate French veterans into his tiny army, wary of their loyalty. Paris was displeased. Togolese opponents whispered to their contacts in Paris and Accra. Come January 1963, Olympio was gunned down during Africa's first coup, the first president assassinated in post-colonial Africa. Eyadema, the soldier who pulled the trigger, had been in the French Foreign Legion. Declassified evidence later showed French officials had actively undermined Olympio's administration and welcomed the regime change. Togo's experiment in full sovereignty died with him. Olympio's dream of monetary freedom was buried, and Togo was folded back into France's orbit under leaders who knew their place. A chilling precedent was set. Resisting France's economic control could be fatal. Patrice Lumumba was not from a French colony. The Congo he led had broken from brutal Belgian rule, yet his fate became a Pan-African cautionary tale. Lumumba was a firebrand who challenged all colonial powers, east or west, declaring that Africans would write their own history in dignity and glory. For this audacity, he lasted mere months in office. In January 1961, Lumumba was overthrown, jailed, and ultimately murdered by firing squad. Executed by secessionist rebels with Belgian officers present, as Western intelligence agencies looked on approvingly. Lumumba was assassinated, with the collusion of Western powers worried about his suspected communist sympathies. His body was dismembered and dissolved in acid to erase any trace. The CIA and its allies had feared another African nation slipping out of the Western camp, and so, a rising African icon was brutally silenced. Though not a Françafrique operation per se, Lumumba's death reverberated across the continent, a stark reminder that any African leader who strayed too far from former colonial masters, French, Belgian, or otherwise, risked swift elimination. In the words of a contemporary, today it is Lumumba, tomorrow it could be any of us. Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea chose defiance at the very birth of independence. In September 1958, when France's President de Gaulle offered a referendum on joining a new French community, every other colony felt compelled to say, "We, not Guinea." Touré thundered, "We prefer poverty in freedom to wealth in slavery." By popular vote, Guinea became the first French African territory to demand immediate independence, effectively slamming the door in France's face. The response from Paris was vindictive and swift. Within weeks, all French technicians, experts, teachers were withdrawn en masse. The departing colonials even ripped out telephone lines, seized records, and destroyed equipment. Aid was cut off, trade ties severed. France did everything possible to ensure the failure of Guinean independence, as one account noted bitterly. Touré's Guinea stood utterly alone, left to seek support from the Eastern Bloc in a Cold War tightrope. The isolation was crippling, but Touré did not bend. He built a one-party socialist state and ruled until 1984, surviving numerous coup plots, some suspected to have French fingerprints. Guinea paid a steep price for Touré's bold non, decades of poverty and paranoia behind what he dubbed the bamboo curtain. Yet, in African eyes, Sékou Touré became a symbol of pride, the man who had faced down de Gaulle and won, at least for a moment. His story underscored that resisting France could mean diplomatic and economic exile, rather than an immediate bullet. Touré's personal fate was natural death. He died of heart failure while in the USA for treatment. But his country's fate was to endure the long, cold shadow of France's wrath. Perhaps no African leader personified anti-imperialist defiance like Captain Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. Rising to power in 1983 at just 33, Sankara was a fiery Marxist and Pan-Africanist with a vision to upend the old order. He renamed the country from the colonial Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of incorruptible people, slashed ministerial perks, expelled the French military base, and lambasted France's neo-colonial meddling at every turn. Sankara spoke bluntly. "He who feeds you, controls you," he warned, urging Africans to reject foreign aid strings. He sided with neither East nor West, to Paris's chagrin. Soon, Sankara's radical policies and charisma made him a target. Behind closed doors, neighboring leaders like Ivory Coast's veteran President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a staunch ally of France, referred to Sankara as the troublesome little leftist. By 1987, the young revolutionary had made too many enemies. On October 15th of that year, gunfire erupted during a National Council meeting in Ouagadougou. Sankara and 12 officials were assassinated in a coup that brought his once friend Blaise Compaoré to power. The role of foreign powers in this regicide has long been debated. France certainly heaved a sigh of relief. In fact, the coup may have had French involvement since the Sankara regime had fallen into disfavor in France. Ivory Coast's Houphouët-Boigny was widely suspected of abetting the plot, with French blessing. Evidence later revealed Houphouët had contacted Compaoré and even helped orchestrate the conspiracy to eliminate Sankara. In one swoop, Africa lost a visionary, and Françafrique rid itself of one of its fiercest critics. Sankara's fall sent an unmistakable warning. A revolutionary who openly defied France's old guard could be eliminated with impunity. To this day, Sankara's portrait is revered by African youth, a martyr cut down for daring to dream of true independence. Our final case study of resistance is a more contemporary one, and perhaps the most geopolitically complex, Laurent Gbagbo of Côte d'Ivoire. A history professor turned opposition firebrand, Gbagbo rose to the presidency of Ivory Coast in 2000, promising to end France's stranglehold on the economy and politics of the West African powerhouse. He inherited a nation divided, largely between a rebel-held Muslim North and a government-controlled Christian South, and a very involved former colonial master. During his tenure, Gbagbo walked a tightrope, publicly cordial to Paris but privately resentful of what he viewed as French meddling in Ivorian affairs. Tensions snapped in November 2004. Amid a civil war, Gbagbo's air force struck a French peacekeeper camp by mistake, killing 9 soldiers. France's response was swift and devastating. French forces destroyed Ivory Coast's small air force on the ground in retaliation. This sparked an explosion of anti-French riots in Abidjan. Mobs of Gbagbo's nationalist youth wing, the Jeunes Patriots, roamed the streets targeting French expatriates, while French troops and helicopters evacuated foreigners. Dozens of Ivorians were shot dead amid clashes, and Gbagbo's government accused France of an effective regime change attempt. Gbagbo himself sued France in the International Court of Justice for aggression, though the case went nowhere. From that point, Gbagbo was an open thorn in Paris's side. When he lost the 2010 election to French-backed challenger Alassane Ouattara, but refused to concede, France seized the chance to act decisively. In April 2011, as Ivory Coast's post-election civil war raged, French military forces, under a UN mandate, directly intervened in Abidjan, firing on Gbagbo's heavy weapons positions. French tanks punched their way to the presidential residence. Cornered in an underground bunker, Gbagbo finally surrendered, not to Ivorian rebels, but to French soldiers who handed him over to Ouattara's fighters. French officials said Gbagbo was arrested by Ouattara's forces backed by the UN and the French military. The image of a French armored column rolling in to remove a sitting African president in 2011 was striking, a scene many Africans likened to a neo-colonial coup in its own right. Gbagbo was hauled off to The Hague to face war crimes charges. He would be acquitted years later. But the lasting message was that even in the new millennium, defying France's preferences could mean political annihilation. Gbagbo's decade in power had seen him try to reorient Ivory Coast away from French dependency, diversifying economic partners, standing up to French diplomats, and questioning the French military's free reign in his country. In the end, he was ousted by a joint French UN operation and replaced by a leader far more agreeable to Western capitals. The cost of defiance, once again, was forfeiting power and liberty. From Olympio to Lumumba, Touré to Sankara and Gbagbo, the pattern is unmistakable. When African leaders resisted the neo-colonial system, whether by seeking independent economic policies, denouncing French dominance, or challenging unfair terms of cooperation, they often met tragic ends. They were isolated, undermined, or eliminated through coups or assassinations, and usually replaced by more compliant figures. This is not to say every incident was a clear Paris-orchestrated hit job. African politics have their own internal dynamics. But in case after case, France or its close allies were at least complicit in sidelining these inconvenient icons of independence. The Françafrique machine had little tolerance for those who wouldn't play by its rules. As one African proverb inspired by these events puts it, "The grass that grows too tall is the first to be cut." Each martyr and ousted president became a cautionary tale to others: collaborate and benefit, or rebel and risk all. Yet their legacies also inspired future generations to keep asking, was the freedom we fought for in the 1960s ever truly realized, or only delayed by neo-colonial chains? By the 1990s, the winds of change were blowing, or so it seemed. The Cold War was over, democracy was blooming across Africa, and France itself was undergoing political turnover. Western powers spoke of good governance and human rights. In Africa, long-ruling French-backed autocrats were aging or faltering. It was a moment ripe for reform, and indeed French presidents from Chirac to Macron would each proclaim, in their own way, a new chapter in relations with Africa. But behind the rhetoric, did the fundamentals of Françafrique really change? Chapter 4's final act examines how France's approach evolved, from President Jacques Chirac's old-school paternalism, through Nicolas Sarkozy's promises to rupture the past, François Hollande's cautious recalibration, and Emmanuel Macron's struggle with a full-blown anti-French backlash. It's a story of superficial shifts and deep continuities, culminating in a dramatic reckoning as African peoples begin to push back en masse against the remnants of French neo-colonial influence. Jacques Chirac came to the French presidency in 1995, but his involvement with Africa went back decades. A protege of late President Pompidou, Chirac had personal friendships with the big men of Francophone Africa, from Togo's Eyadema to Gabon's Omar Bongo. He saw himself as a guardian of France's African pré carré, backyard. If anything, the Chirac era was a last hurrah of the old Françafrique. Under his watch, France intervened militarily in several African crises, often unilaterally, sending troops to Rwanda, 1994, albeit too late to stop genocide and controversially on the wrong side of history, to Zaire, 1997, to evacuate Europeans, to Ivory Coast, 2002-4, as peacekeepers who became kingmakers, and more. Chirac was unabashed about prioritizing stability and French interests over democratic niceties. Famously, he remarked, "Africa is not ready for democracy," calling multi-party politics a luxury for African countries. On a visit to Côte d'Ivoire, Chirac stood beside President for Life, Houphouët-Boigny, and opined that insisting on Western-style democracy might be a mistake. He praised regimes like Tunisia's Ben Ali despite their human rights abuses, emphasizing economic development over political freedom. Such statements drew outrage from African civil society and human rights groups, but they accurately reflected French policy of the time. Under Chirac, the Elf Aquitaine oil scandal, exposing huge bribes to African officials and French politicians, came to light, underscoring how deeply business and politics intertwined in Françafrique. Chirac's France also continued to host controversial figures, granting residency or asylum to ousted dictators like Hissène Habré of Chad and even Bokassa, the deposed emperor of Car, for a time. In short, Chirac embodied continuity. The patron-client relationships remained, with France acting as the ultimate arbiter in its former colonies. If a dictator was loyal, France protected him. If a leader strayed, France nudged him back in line. By the early 2000s, however, this cozy order was increasingly under strain from both within Africa, pressure for democracy, and within France, scandals and public fatigue. Chirac's departure in 2007 marked the end of an era, and many Africans hoped it would also mark the end of Françafrique. Nicolas Sarkozy, the brash conservative who succeeded Chirac, came into office proclaiming a rupture. France's relationship with Africa must change, he insisted. During his campaign, Sarkozy had said he wished to end the system of Françafrique, the shadowy networks of influence and corruption binding Paris to African elites. Many took him at his word, expecting bold moves, perhaps closing the notorious Africa cell at the Élysée Palace, or reforming the CFA franc, or reducing France's military footprint. And initially, there were gestures. Sarkozy shuffled advisors, even invited outspoken critics like Senegal's President Wade to advise on a new paradigm. However, the break with the past proved more cosmetic than real. Tellingly, in the very trip where Sarkozy could have turned a page, a state visit to Senegal in July 2007, he delivered what is now infamous as the Dakar speech. In front of African youth, Sarkozy's tone turned patronizing and historical. He spoke of the African who has not fully entered into history, claiming Africans were trapped in cyclical time, with no idea of progress. The audience was stunned. Outrage rippled across Africa. One African magazine headlined it, "The Insult." Critics said the speech smelled of racism and betrayed a deep-seated colonial mindset. Whatever goodwill Sarkozy had earned evaporated that day. It seemed Françafrique was reasserting itself through his very words. In practice, Sarkozy's term saw continuity with a twist of activism. He maintained close ties with certain African strongmen. For instance, he cozied up to Libya's Gaddafi initially and Gabon's Bongo, but also took interventionism to new theaters. Under Sarkozy, France undertook two major military actions in Africa: Ivory Coast in 2011, where French forces helped depose Laurent Gbagbo, as we've seen, and Libya later in 2011, where French warplanes spearheaded NATO's bombing campaign that toppled Muammar Gaddafi. The Libya intervention was sold as humanitarian, but critics argue it reflected old habits, France deciding the fate of an African nation. Libya, though not a former colony, was in France's strategic sphere, in pursuit of its own geopolitical interests. Sarkozy did push some reforms in aid and business transparency, and he officially abolished the ominous Africa cell at the presidency, but then simply relocated its functions to the foreign ministry, arguably. By the end of Sarkozy's tenure, few in Africa believed Françafrique was truly over. A Cameroonian editorial dryly noted, "Sarkozy promised to kill Françafrique. Instead, he gave it a designer suit and a new phone number." The networks of influence, military bases in Djibouti, Gabon, Chad, French advisors embedded in African presidencies, opaque resource deals, persisted, even if the rhetoric had shifted. When François Hollande took office in 2012, he raised hopes for a more fundamental shift. A socialist and, ostensibly a human rights champion, Hollande declared, "La Françafrique est finie." Françafrique is finished. Unlike his predecessors, he had little personal affinity for African strongmen and seemed genuinely uneasy about France's neo-colonial baggage. Early in his term, Hollande oversaw the withdrawal of French troops from the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and many assumed he'd also scale back France's military presence in Africa. Indeed, Hollande initially tried a hands-off approach. For example, when a rebellion threatened to topple President Bozizé of Central African Republic in late 2012, Bozizé begged France for intervention. But Hollande publicly refused, stating French troops in Bangui were there only to protect French nationals, not prop up regimes. The days of cozy Françafrique ties are over, Hollande pronounced. This was a notable break, a French president pointedly declining to save a longtime ally in Africa. Bozizé fell from power, shocked that the old safety net was gone. Yet Hollande's principled restraint did not last long. Almost concurrently, crisis brewed in Mali. Jihadist militants linked to al-Qaeda seized the northern half of the country in 2012, threatening to overrun the capital. In January 2013, at Mali's request and with UN backing, Hollande launched Operation Serval, a full-scale French military intervention to push back the Islamists. French troops were welcomed as liberators by cheering crowds in Bamako, and for a moment, Hollande was celebrated in Africa. Later in 2013, as sectarian violence spiraled in the Central African Republic, Hollande intervened again with Operation Sangaris to halt massacres, again under a UN mandate. These actions were humanitarian in justification, stopping terror and genocide. And indeed, many Africans praised them initially. However, cynics noted a pattern. France still acted as the gendarme of Africa when its interests, or security concerns, were at stake. Some wondered, had Françafrique truly died, or had it simply been repackaged as multilateral peacekeeping? Hollande was careful to seek international approval and African Union support for his interventions, to distance them from the unilateral gunboat diplomacy of old. Nonetheless, each operation cemented France's continued role as policeman in its former colonies. Politically, Hollande did implement changes. He ended the notorious cash-filled briefcases that used to circulate between African leaders and French party coffers, a hallmark of Chirac-era corruption. He pushed for the replacement of the CFA francs with a new currency, the ECO, although that project stalled. He encouraged French companies to treat African partners fairly, at least publicly. Still, critics argue these were marginal tweaks. By 2014, France established Operation Barkhane, a long-term anti-terror mission across 5 Sahel nations: Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mauritania. Barkhane stationed thousands of French soldiers indefinitely on African soil, a deployment larger and more sustained than any during Chirac or Sarkozy's time. To African critics, this looked like Françafrique under a counter-terrorism banner. Yes, France was fighting jihadists, a real threat, but it also gained a pretext to maintain troops near uranium mines in Niger and to bolster allies like Chad's Idriss Déby. Hollande's paradox was that even as he denounced the old ways, circumstances drew France deeper into Africa militarily than before. Comme 1017, toen Hollande uittrad, was het Franse publiek moe van afstandelijke conflicten en Afrikaanse publieken werden steeds warier van Frankrijk's ware motieven. Enter Emmanuel Macron, France's youngest president, born after most African nations' independence, a man who proclaimed himself of a new generation with no direct colonial hangover. In a highly anticipated speech in Ouagadougou in November 2017, Macron told an audience of African students, "I am from a generation that doesn't tell Africa what to do." He promised a partnership of equals, an end to the patronizing attitudes of the past. Macron even symbolically ordered the return of African art treasures looted during colonization, and sponsored Africa-France summits focused on youth and entrepreneurship, rather than heads of state chumminess. He spoke of dramatically redefining France's presence, including closing bases and switching French troops to a more supporting role. To many observers, Macron appeared to grasp that the old neo-colonial approach had exhausted itself. But good intentions collided with hard reality. During Macron's tenure, 2017 to present, Françafrique's ultimate unraveling seems to have accelerated, not entirely by Macron's design. At first, Macron doubled down on the Barkhane mission against jihadists, urging that France was preventing a terrorist caliphate in the Sahel. However, the longer French troops stayed, the more resentment brewed among local populations, who saw their security situation worsening and their sovereignty compromised. Anti-French sentiment, once limited to intellectual circles, exploded on social media and street protests. Images spread of young villagers blockading a French military convoy in Burkina Faso in 2021. Unarmed men, women, and children physically stopping armored vehicles, chanting for France to leave. Those images went viral on Facebook and Twitter. Memes and videos accusing France of secretly sponsoring terrorists to justify its presence circulated widely, often amplified by Russian disinformation, as Western analysts note. Macron's government dismissed many criticisms as the result of Russian manipulation. Indeed, Russian flags often appeared at Sahel protests. But this explanation rang hollow to African ears. The anger on the ground was genuine, fueled by decades of perceived French hypocrisy and exploitation. As one young Nigerian activist put it, "I hate France, but I speak French. The French stole from us and massacred us for 400 years. They take everything and call it help." That raw sentiment, shared by millions of African youth, 65% of Africa's population is under 30, fed into the coups of 2020 to 2023. Young people in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger largely applauded the military takeovers, seeing them as a chance to finally eject the French and reclaim national pride. As the Brazilian press observed, the new junta governments loudly expressed the anti-French sentiment that was already strong among young people before they took power. Macron, for his part, made some tactical pivots. In 2019, he announced a reform of the CFA franc, finally renaming it, in West Africa at least, to the ECO, and reducing French control, a change greeted with skepticism and still not fully realized. In 2021, facing growing hostility in Mali, Macron unilaterally declared an end to Operation Barkhane, as we know it, and in early 2022, France withdrew all troops from Mali after a nasty diplomatic spat with Bamako's new military rulers. The French ambassador was expelled from Mali. Russian Wagner mercenaries rolled in to fill the void. A cascade followed. Burkina Faso's coup regime in 2022 told France to close its special forces base and leave, which French forces did in 2023. In Niger's 2023 coup, protesters tried to storm the French embassy, furious at France's refusal, initially, to recognize the junta. By late 2023, faced with mass rallies and an impasse with Niger's new authorities, Macron made the stunning announcement that France would withdraw its ambassador and the last of its 1,500 troops from Niger as well. Al Jazeera analysis dubbed 2023 the year France's post-colonial influence collapsed in much of Africa. The final straw in France's long tumble from grace in Africa, it said, was the last French military flight out of Niger's capital, a symbol that an era had ended. Anti-French sentiment across the Sahel had reached fever pitch, with commentators declaring, "Au revoir, la Françafrique." Even places like Mali and Burkina, once linchpins of France's security architecture, pivoted away entirely. Mali's leaders evicting French institutions, banning French media broadcasts, and teaming up with new great power patrons. Yet Macron's stance hardened in other ways. Frustrated by what he saw as ingratitude, he lambasted African leaders in late 2022 for feeding anti-French narratives. He notably complained that some regimes indulge anti-French feeling to divert attention from their own failures, a statement that, however true or not, further soured his image. To Macron's critics, his mix of youthful outreach and testy lectures showed a pragmatic neo-colonialism at heart. He would engage Africa for markets and security, but was quick to scold African society for not appreciating France's actions. African Union officials bristled at Macron's occasional tone, such as when he implied that without French intervention, countries like Mali might not even exist in their current form. This only confirmed suspicions that the mindset of French superiority hadn't really disappeared at the highest levels. Now, as we stand in the mid-2020s, what is the state of Françafrique? In one sense, it lies in tatters. France has been militarily ousted from its former colonies, Mali, Burkina Faso, and, pending, Niger, a scenario unthinkable a decade ago. Its troops are back home, or repositioning to coastal allies like Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. The CFA Franc, long a lightning rod of anti-French critique, is set to be phased out in West Africa, though not yet in Central Africa. Political leaders who once counted on Élysée support now hedge their bets with new partners, Russia, China, Turkey, etc. Social media is awash with Pan-African voices calling out French neo-colonialism, making it hard for Paris's narratives to dominate as before. Public opinion in many Francophone African countries, especially among the youth, has turned sharply against any French presence. France faces growing anti-French sentiment across the region. As one report dryly noted, the old Monsieur Afrique power broker figures, the Focard-style emissaries, have faded. And yet, the story isn't so tidy. France still maintains a substantial economic footprint. French companies still control key sectors, from ports to telecoms to oil, in many countries. Cultural influence persists through language and education. There are still French military bases in Djibouti, Gabon, though downsized, and Côte d'Ivoire, and French troops in the restive Sahel state of Chad, whose government remains a crucial French ally. And crucially, France's elite still see Africa as strategically important, perhaps not as a chasse gardée, exclusive preserve, like before, but as a theater where French foreign policy can project influence. President Macron, in early 2023, embarked on an Africa tour to reset relations, acknowledging past mistakes, but also pointedly declaring that the era of French interference is over. However, on the streets of Kinshasa and Bamako, protesters scoffed, seeing it as too little, too late. The trust had been broken. What we witness today is a reckoning long deferred. The script of Françafrique, the coup, the secret deals, the puppet presidents, the tricolor flag flying high, is being challenged by an awakened African public. In scenes that would have been hard to imagine in the 1970s, thousands of young Africans chant for the departure of French ambassadors and troops, sometimes even vandalizing symbols of France in their countries. France dégage, France get out, has become a rallying cry from the campuses to the marketplaces. This groundswell is fueled by painful socio-economic realities, unemployment, inequality, for which many blame the old neo-colonial arrangements. Meanwhile, French officials scramble to save face, insisting their intentions are good, fighting terror, aiding development. But the narrative has slipped from their grasp. December 2023, Niamey, Niger. In a low-key departure, the last French soldiers board a military plane, ending France's presence in yet another former colony. A French diplomatic memo soberly notes that relations with its ex-colonies have deteriorated to a new low. For France, this is an astonishing setback. For many Africans, a moment of pride and emancipation. The chapter that began with de Gaulle's lofty declarations in 1960, "Je vous ai compris, I have understood you," he told restive colonies, is closing with a far more humbling scene. The ex-metropole asked to leave, its prestige in Africa at rock bottom. History has a sense of irony. The very nations France once saved from chaos, in its view, now dismiss France as a source of chaos. Even so, the end of Françafrique's worst excesses does not automatically herald a bright new dawn. Power abhors a vacuum. Other foreign powers, Russia's Wagner mercenaries, China's investors, Turkey's strategists, are rushing in to court those same African states. They bring their own forms of influence, their own strings attached. And internally, some of the military regimes that kicked out the French have slid into authoritarian practices of their own, rallying popular support with anti-French nationalism while clamping down on dissent. The legacy of Françafrique is complicated. Decades of stifled democratic institutions cannot be undone overnight. Yet, something fundamental is shifting. As the youth of Africa find their voice, Armed with smartphones and a keen sense of history's injustices, the old hierarchies look increasingly untenable. France at last is being forced to confront its colonial sins in the court of public opinion. Statues of colonial figures have been toppled. Demands for apology and reparations for colonial-era crimes like the genocide in Cameroon or the abuses in Algeria grow louder. It's a season of soul-searching for the French and of assertive self-assertion for the Africans. In this investigative journey through coups, resistance, and evolution, we have seen how Françafrique, that peculiar French brand of neo-colonialism, has shaped and warped the destinies of nations. We trace the clandestine coups blessed in Paris, the courageous leaders who tried to break free and paid with blood, and the slow metamorphosis of France's strategy from overt control to subtler influence, until even that subtler influence began crumbling under popular backlash. This saga is far from over, but one thing is clear. The days when Paris could make or break African regimes with a phone call or siphon Africa's wealth under sweetheart deals are drawing to a close amid fire and fury. The curtain falls on this story with a sense of suspense. A historic weight hangs in the balance. Françafrique, once seemingly immortal, teeters on the edge of irrelevance. Will it be replaced by true partnerships or just new forms of dependency? Can African nations fully reclaim their sovereignty and chart a course free of external puppeteers? And will France finally become the partner it always claimed to be, rather than the master it always was? The answers are being written now, in the streets of Bamako, the halls of the Élysée, and the tweets of a generation unafraid to speak truth to power. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to History Scrolls for more untold truths and controversial chapters of African history. And comment below, your voice matters in rewriting the narrative.